Hello, and welcome to Not Just Books, the monthly show from the Williamson County Public Library about your world and what's going on in Williamson County. Today, we have a very special edition of Not Just Books. We have the mayor giving us a proclamation honoring Constitution Week. We have members of the Old Glory chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution here with us to conduct story times. So we also have a video of a farmer by the name of William Patton, and he is portrayed by Stephen Kiern. Also, I have an interview with Mrs. Tobias Lear to talk about the days of George Washington and conducted by the Old Glory secretary. We'll be right back.
Thank you for being with us today. This week is the week that our Constitution of the United States of America has been designated to be a constitutional week. So if you would allow me to read the proclamation that is going into place. The Constitution of the United States of America, the guardian of our liberties, embodies the principles of limited government in a republic dedicated to rule by law. And this particular one designates our 233rd anniversary of the framing of the Constitution of the United States of America by our Constitutional Convention. And whereas the United States Constitution stands as a testament to the tyranny of the Americans throughout history to maintain their liberties, their freedoms, and their inalienable rights, and it is fitting and proper to accord official recognition to this magnificent document and in the memorial anniversary and to the patriotic celebrations which will commensurate it. And the celebration of the Constitution was started by the Daughters of the American Revolution. In 1955, DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, petitioned Congress to set aside September 17th through the 23rd annually to be dedicated for the observance of Constitution Week. The resolution was later adopted by the U.S. Congress and signed into public law on August the 2nd, 1956 by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Whereas the Williamson County area Daughters of the American Revolution chapters include Old Glory, the John Nolan, the Traveler's Rest, the Sarah Polk, and the Brigadier General Richard Wynn, and Public Law 915 guarantees the issuance of a proclamation each year by the President of the United States designating September the 17th to the 23rd as Constitution Week. So, with that in mind, I, as the mayor, have signed and authorized the week of September the 17th through the 23rd as Constitutional Week here in Williamson County. It is only fitting during this very tumultuous time, this pandemic that we're going through, that we are still having some sense of normalcy in our society, and it's an honor and it's a privilege, and I thank these ladies for bringing this forth once again this year.
Each September 17th since 1787, we as a country have celebrated the Constitution of the United States. Today, the Old Glory chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution, and the Williamson County Public Library have once again partnered to bring you a slice of history from the constitutional era, and maybe a few seldom mentioned and hopefully interesting facts. My guest this morning is Mrs. Tobias Lear. Welcome, Mrs. Lear.
Well, good morning, Mrs. Greenwald. I am Frances Dandridge Henley Lear. My husband, Tobias, served George Washington from 1786 to 1799 as his personal secretary, and later in a military capacity as his chief aide. To understand my husband's place in history, it is important to understand the events taking place at that time. Officially ending the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Tobias joined the General Staff the following year. It was a remarkable time when, in 1787, the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. After several months' deliberation, representatives from 12 state delegations approved the Constitution. Of the 42 delegates present, 39 delegates signed it, and the convention adjourned. By 1789, ratification was complete. The first Congress under the Constitution convened in New York City, and the first presidential election took place. George Washington was elected President of the United States, and my husband accompanied President Washington from Virginia to take up residence in New York.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much. And on a more personal note, how did you meet your husband?
Oh, well, I was not the first Mrs. Lear, no. Tobias had been married twice before. His first wife died of yellow fever during the epidemic of 1793, and his second wife died of tuberculosis. I met Mrs. Lear through my aunt, Martha Washington, and Aunt Martha, as did most of my friends and family, called me Fanny.
Oh, very nice. Tell me a little bit about your relationship, your husband's relationship with President Washington. What was it like?
Well, it was a close personal friendship, as well as a professional relationship. Tobias and President Washington frequently dined alone together. Tobias completed the president's expense reports and conducted his personal errands. That is not to say their relationship was not tested. Oh no. Tobias often struggled financially. He once borrowed funds, while collecting rents on the president's behalf. When discovered, President Washington was furious. But after 2 days, Tobias apologized and was quickly forgiven.
Well, you, as a member of the family, have a unique perspective on what might arguably be the most famous man in American history. What stands out to you when you think of George Washington?
Well, it was his notable manners and unwavering principles. At the young age of 14, that young man, George, wrote down 110 rules under the title Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. These rules were drawn from an English translation of a French book of maxims, and they were intended to polish manners, keep alive the best affections of the heart, impress the obligations of moral virtues, teach how to treat others in social relations, and above all, inculcate the practice of a perfect self-control. I happen to have a copy of this little book right here with me today. One of my favorites is the very first. Every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect to those that are present. But also included in those which are simply practical, even amusing, there are others. Do not at any time put a bite in your mouth till the former is swallowed. Let not your morsels be too big.
I think that's familiar. My mother used and grandmother used to tell
Oh,
me
yes,
that
oh, yes.
constantly. Is there anything else that you would like to share about this period or the Constitution or Washington with the audience?
Well, yes, I would like to. Fittingly, Tobias was with President Washington at his deathbed. Washington instructed that Tobias wait 3 days before burial out of fear of being entombed alive. My husband said he died peacefully between 10 and 11 p.m. on December 14th, 1799, with Martha seated at the foot of his bed. His last words were, "'Tis well."
Well, thank you for that. It was also rumored after Washington's death, Mr. Lear reviewed and perhaps destroyed personal and professional papers from Washington's estate. Do you believe this was true?
I do not know, truthfully, but if he did so, it was out of love and respect that he chose to protect President Washington's reputation and privacy.
It's one of the big questions of history.
It sure is. Yes, it is.
Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Lear, for being with us
It
today.
has been my pleasure.
And we'll
Mrs.
be right
Greenwald.
back. Welcome back. I have a very special guest with me today who is going to be talking about his life as a farmer and about the U.S. Constitution. And his name is William Patton. William, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to do it, Miss Dolores.
Thank you so much. You live in Rockbridge County, Virginia.
That is correct. Yes, ma'am.
And you participated you're now a veteran of the Revolutionary War.
Yes, ma'am. Glad to do that. I was proud to say it.
Very good. Now, you brought a little bit of show and tell with you today, so tell us about your rifle here.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you for asking. Yes, this rifle was actually made by a dear friend of our family, and his name was Josiah Taylor. He is an excellent gunsmith. Anyone needs a fine rifle for the frontier, I heartily recommend Mr. Josiah Taylor. And as I mentioned, he was a dear friend of our family. He made a number of rifles for our family members, and the Continental Army kept him busy during the Revolution. And he made this, and it's been by my side through the Revolutionary War and to this day.
Well, before we talk about your children,
Yes, ma'am.
and your farming, let's talk about what brought your family to America.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Well, my dad was a captain of a ship, Captain John Patton, and he and his family were Presbyterians there in Ireland. They had initially been in England, and the English did not particularly care for the Presbyterians being there in England, so they moved them over to Ireland. And my dad, being the sea captain he was, heard more and more about the wonderful things that were available here in the New World. And one day he packed us all up. I was but a child, and he packed us all up, and we sailed the Atlantic, and we had arrived in Baltimore Harbor, and we were there for a bit, and eventually my family and I arrived here in Rockbridge County. Now, our son, also named John, John has, in the last few years, he has turned his eye even further westward, and he's talking about possibly leaving Rockbridge County and going to East Tennessee. We'll see what happens about that. That'll be his choice, though.
Well, I love Tennessee. That's a good choice.
He thinks it is too.
Well, let me ask you about this. You've been married twice, William,
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
and you have 8 children.
8 children, yes. My first wife's name was Elizabeth, and Elizabeth and I had 3 children together before she died, and then I remarried Miss Agnes, and with Miss Agnes, I have now 5 children, so I have a total of 8 children.
And
A handful.
a handful, but I'm sure they help you with your day-to-day tasks. On the
Oh,
farm.
always, always. The girls love to milk the cows and make the butter. They of course, I like them to make butter. Indeed, and they do wonderful pastries. Agnes has taught all of them to cook and to sew excellently. You can see I have not missed very many meals, especially since after we ran out the red coats. Life got to be much easier and simpler after that. And then my boys and I tend to do the heavy things around the farm, the planting and the sowing of the and harvesting of the crops. And then we, of course, we certainly love to hunt and to have the fresh venison when we're able to do that. And we have a few pigs, of course, and that's great for ham, and we all love bacon.
Well, you're making me hungry, William, I tell you.
Regardless of the question, the answer is always bacon.
Well, I would expect that life on the farm is better than what your parents had in Ireland.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We, as I mentioned before, my father and the family in England and Ireland were Presbyterians, and of course we're Presbyterians here as well on the frontier. And I wish my dad would have been able to have seen us now. He believed in the idea and ideals of America, and he had already passed away before our country had won its hard-earned freedom. And I know that he would be very, very proud to see where his family is now.
Well, 1786
Yes, ma'am.
is a very important year
That's what I understand.
in American history because in 1787 there was a constitutional meeting opened in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania State House, known as Independence Hall. And the Declaration of Independence had been signed and adopted 11 years earlier. So, following that, the meeting this year in May 1787 had to do with the U.S. Constitution.
Yes, ma'am.
And it established a national government that you, as a veteran of the Revolutionary War, helped to make that possible.
Yes,
That's
ma'am.
very exciting.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Those are kind words indeed, Miss Dolores. Thank you so much. I was but one small part in that conflict. I felt that I did my duty. I felt that it was important, not just to me personally, but for the future of freedom. Certainly here in the United States, but maybe, just maybe, the lamp that we light here will possibly go on to shine throughout the entire world.
That is very inspirational and
you, ma'am.
hopefully very true.
One would hope.
The Constitution was actually signed by individuals as well as Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, on September 17th, 1787. And thank you again. I really appreciate you coming today.
Glad to do it.
And talking about the importance of the Constitution in 1786 and today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
It's
you
been my
so
pleasure
much.
to be here.
We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back. We have a very special treat today in celebration of Constitution Week. We have Old Glory DAR chapter historian Joy Graham going to read 2 picture books for kiddos. So gather them around if you have kids in the house, and I'm handing it over to Joy right now. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Dolores. I've got a question for you. Why is it important to know about the Constitution? Well, the Constitution is the supreme law, the highest law for our country. It's a list of rules and promises for our government and people to follow and obey in order for us to live happy and safe and free lives. The story of how it came into being written is a tale of persistence as delegates kept on despite obstacles at that time that made their task sometimes seem impossible. It's a tale of creativity, being very creative, these delegates providing a framework for government entirely new. History might have gone a little different if it hadn't been for these men and the genius of these men. And we should be grateful to James Madison, to George Washington, to Benjamin Franklin, and the others who gathered in Philadelphia. We should be grateful also to the men and women such as Patrick Douglas, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Martin Luther King Jr., who in later centuries took up that work of these founding fathers, making this union that formed in 1787 a more perfect one that we know today. Now, let's go back in history, back to 1781, and listen to the story of how the Constitution came into being. Astride his favorite horse, Nelson, General George Washington looked on as thousands of British soldiers marched out of Yorktown, Virginia, to lay down their arms. It was October 19th, 1781, and America, with the help from France, had just won the battle that would end the Revolutionary War. For the British, the loss was a shock. Theirs was the mightiest army in the world, and they had thought it impossible that Americans could defeat them. According to tradition, the soldiers marching out of Yorktown to surrender played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." For citizens of our country living on the vast and bountiful continent, it seemed a new age was dawning. A free and independent America would surely prosper and become great in this mighty nation. But over the next several years, trouble became apparent. Americans had adopted rules for governing called the Articles of Confederation, and they didn't work very well. Congress, which was supposed to be in charge of the Confederation or Union of States, did not have enough power. It could not prevent states from printing their own money. It could not get them to help defend America or to pay off the debts from the Revolutionary War. Other countries, sensing the weakness of the United States, took advantage. The British refused to move out of military posts that were supposed to give up after the Revolutionary War. In Massachusetts, farmers couldn't pay their debts, rose up against the government. When they tried to seize a building in Springfield where guns and ammunition were kept, militia fired upon them. Americans were killing Americans. Was our country, which had so recently won its independence, now going to fall apart? In 1787, delegates from 12 states traveled to a convention in Philadelphia to figure out a better plan for governing the country. Congress had instructed them to revise the Articles of Confederation. But some were thinking well beyond that. James Madison of Virginia, the first delegate to arrive, had studied how nations worked and was convinced America needed a much stronger government than the Articles could provide. And he said it should happen soon. The current government, he believed, was near collapsing. In his room at a Philadelphia boarding house, Madison, a small man of great learning, labored over a plan to present to the convention. His boldest idea was that the nation's government start with the people. As it was, state legislators were choosing the members of Congress. Madison proposed that the people have a direct say in who represented them. George Washington, who had returned to private life after the Revolutionary War, arrived in Philadelphia on May 13th, the day before the convention. Although he didn't like leaving his beloved home of Mount Vernon, Washington came to the convention because he was worried. 13 states, all pulling in different directions, were bringing ruin upon America. Bells rang out to celebrate Washington's arrival, and joyful crowds gathered to greet him. The people of Philadelphia remembered how this tall, dignified man had persisted in the darkest hours of the Revolution, when it had seemed impossible that America would win her war for independence. They remembered how he had given up power after the war, when some had wanted him to become a king. All across America, he was loved and respected, which made his presence in Philadelphia especially important. With him at the convention, Americans were more likely to look favorably upon the delegates' decision. Not until May 25th, 11 days after the convention was supposed to start, were there enough delegates for it to begin. 29 men gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, elected George Washington the convention's president, and made rules, including one that pledged them all to secrecy. James Madison had used the time leading up to the convention to present his ideas to his fellow Virginians. And on May 29th, one of the Virginia representatives proposed Madison's plan to the assembled delegates. As Madison, seated close to George Washington, took notes, Governor Edmund Randolph described a government of 3 branches: legislative, or the Congress, judicial, or the courts, and a national executive. The legislative branch would have 2 parts, or houses, with the people of each state electing the members of the first house. Some delegates argued that the people couldn't be trusted to choose their own representatives, but most disagreed. They thought they could. They thought the place for government to begin with was with the people. What nearly brought the convention to an end was the idea of the large states becoming more important. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had 1 vote, but the Virginia plan gave more representatives and more votes to states with more people. Delegates from the large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts thought that was only fair, but delegates from the small states believed that their interests would be trampled upon. William Patton of New Jersey, scolding the delegates for going so far beyond the Articles of Confederation, presented a plan that preserved equality in voting. It was rejected, but the small states would not give up, and delegates continued to argue bitterly. The oldest delegate was inventor and statesman Benjamin Franklin. At 81, he had trouble walking and was carried in a chair from his home to the convention. Franklin commanded great respect, but not even he could get quarreling delegates to put their anger aside. Through most of June they fought, their tempers made worse by the hot weather, and they were in a building where they closed the windows and the doors to keep it a secret. It was sweltering as Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed that in one house of the legislature, states be represented according to size, and in the other, the Senate, each state have an equal number of votes. But the idea went nowhere. Large states were not willing to give up anything to the smaller ones. Dr. Franklin suggested that the delegates send for a chaplain to lead them in prayer. The leaders of the revolution had sought God's help, he said, and so should those who were trying to build a new nation. The delegates did not send for a chaplain, but as the 4th of July neared, they did stop arguing long enough to appoint a committee to seek a way out of their difficulties. Acting on a suggestion by Dr. Franklin, the committee crafted what became known as the Great Compromise. It was Mr. Sherman's proposal more appealing to the large states by having all legislation concerning money begin in the first house of the legislature, where big states had more power. One evening in the garden, Dr. Franklin showed his visitors a curiosity someone had sent him. It was a two-headed snake, preserved in a vial. Such a creature made the point, he said, that compromise was often crucial to progress. But when the committee took its suggestion for compromise back to the convention, delegates from large states still resisted. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, a tall, commanding man with a wooden leg, was particularly angry that small states were threatening to form a separate union unless there was equal voting in the Senate. The country would be united one way or another, he said. If persuasion does not unite us, the sword will. It seemed as though the convention might fall apart, and with it, our country. With failure looming, a few delegates had change of heart. In the close and momentous vote of July 16th, the convention adopted the Great Compromise. In one house, states would be represented according to population, and in the other, they would have an equal number of votes. The delegates moved on to the decisions, and by July 26, they were ready to have a group called the Committee of Detail to work on organizing the points. While members of the committee were at work, other delegates took a break. George Washington went fishing. Gathering again on August 6th to talk about the draft, delegates soon took up a question they had discussed many times before. How should the president be elected? Should state legislatures make the choice, or members of Congress? They finally agreed on a system of electors that would allow the president to be chosen indirectly by the people. The delegates also decided that the people should be in charge of ratifying the Constitution. Rather than seek the approval of state legislators, delegates chose to submit the Constitution to specifically elected conventions in every state. When the Committee of Style and Argument, the delegates assigned to write the final version of the Constitution. They got to work. They emphasized at the beginning of the document that the Constitution would be the supreme law only when the people decided it should be. On September 17th, after the final draft was read aloud, Benjamin Franklin addressed the convention. He told the delegates that there were parts of the document of which he did not agree, but that over a long life, he had learned that he was not always right. On the whole, he said, the Constitution was astonishingly good, and he hoped that other delegates who had doubts would join him in signing it. Several refused. George Washington, as president of the convention, was the first to put his name on the Constitution. Then 37 others followed, state by state. As the last delegate signed the document, Dr. Franklin looked at the sun painted on the back of George Washington's chair, and he saw it as a sign of a new beginning for America. By July 4th, 1788, the people of 10 states had, after sometimes fierce debate, ratified the Constitution. Since only 9 states were required to make the Constitution the supreme law, it was time for a celebration. In Philadelphia, after early morning bells and a cannon salute, crowds lined the street to watch high-stepping horses lead a parade of flags, bands, and floats. A carved and painted 20-gun ship, the Union, made its way through town on its carriage. The grand federal edifice, a specially constructed building honoring the Union, passed by, pulled by 10 white horses. Citizens of every occupation marched. Weavers followed chairmakers, bricklayers and gliders, bookbinders and coppersmiths and clergymen. And at the end of the parade came feasting and an oration. "Happy country," proclaimed the convention delegate, James Wilson. "May thy happiness be perpetual." Under the Constitution, America would become the nation George Washington imagined, a place of freedom in which people can aspire to high goals and seek happiness, a country exemplifying the blessings of ordered liberty. But the Constitution that the delegates signed in Philadelphia in 1787 was not perfect, and becoming aware of that, delegates included in the Constitution ways of changing or amending it. The first 10 amendments, called the Bill of Rights, was passed by 2/3 of the Congress in 1789 and ratified 3/4 of the states in 1791, providing protection for the many rights we have as individuals. They include safeguards for freedom of speech, religion, and the press. Amendments added after the Civil War did away with slavery and provided that the right to vote will not be restricted on account of race. In 1920, the Constitution was amended to recognize the right of women to vote. The document created in Philadelphia in 1787 has changed our country and has changed, growing in justice over the years. Once there were Americans who looked at the Constitution and did not see themselves. Today, we the people includes all of us, working together to make our country, our great country, greater still. And now I'd like to read you a really short little book called We the Kids. This is a short little book, and it's about the preamble to the Constitution. And a preamble is an introduction part. A part of the preamble sounds like just what we naturally do, kind of common sense. But a couple of 100 years ago, things were really, really different, and things weren't common at all. There were rules, there were not rules to follow. And, you know, for instance, if you wrote something or said something that the people in charge didn't like, why, they could throw you in jail, or they could tar and feather you. Oh, my goodness. Now, even though our country's changed a lot, if you listen really hard, the rules in our Constitution still make good sense. And now, we use tar for paving roads, and the feathers, they can still stay on the chickens. There's some big words in this book, and I'll try to explain some of them to you, but these big words also express big ideas. And also, look for the dog in this story. He'll help you understand more about what this book says. We the Kids. This is a book illustrated and forwarded by David Catrow. We the people of the United States. Now that means everybody in our country, including kids. In order to form a more perfect union. That means to come together, to make things better for everyone who lives in the country. Establish justice. Now that means to make things fair and honest for everyone. See the rules? It says, make fair, share, no pulling hair. Ensure domestic tranquility. Now that's a big word. But what does that mean? That means to make sure that we all can have a nice life and get along with each other. Provide for the common defense. Well, now that means to protect us from harm and other people who might try to harm us as in war. To protect our country and the kids. Promote the general welfare. Okay, That means to make life good for everyone. Having enough to eat, having a place to live, being safe, and having friends is part of what makes our life good. And ensure the blessings of liberty. That means to protect our rights and freedoms and not let anyone take it away. Being able to choose our religion, to say what we think, and to get together with friends and family is part of the freedoms that we have. To ourselves and our posterity. Oh, that means kids, parents, and other grown-ups born in our country after we were. Do ordain and establish this Constitution. That means to write it down and then live by the list of rules that are for our government and help our people to obey these rules. For the United States of America. I've got one question. Does everybody know who this is? That's right, it's George Washington. And I know there's a picture of him hanging in every school in our county because the Old Glory chapter put them there. So the next time you walk by that picture of George Washington, I want you to remember that he not only fought for our country in the Revolutionary War, but he was the president in that assembly of men that made the Constitution the supreme law of our country. I'm kind of proud of him because my ancestor that brought me into the Daughters of the American Revolution, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was at Valley Forge fighting with him. I guess they got to talk. So that's pretty cool. The next time you see him, say, "Thank you, George. Thank you, President Washington. Thank you for helping start this wonderful country."
Thank you so much for this. It brings tears to my eyes to hear the Constitution. It's very inspiring, no matter how long it was written ago.
It still pertains today.
It absolutely does. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll be right back.
Maria, so how's work?
It was fourth period biology. Our students just weren't getting how easily viruses spread. So Miss Bell and I had them role play a zombie virus outbreak. By the time they had all learned the lesson, all the living were dead. Hey, how's your job going?
That big sales meeting I planned? Next year. I might get to go.
Cool.
Thank you for joining us today for Not Just Books. Had a very special edition today, a quarantine COVID type edition, but celebrating the Constitution with the wonderful members of the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, Old Glory chapter of the DAR. Thank them so much for coming today. Also, thank Mayor Rogers Anderson for joining us and giving a proclamation to us today honoring our great Constitution and celebrating Constitution Week. Keep up with the library of what we're doing. We're doing a lot of things, especially virtual right now. So you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com WCPLTN. Follow us on Twitter at twitter.com WCPLTN. Also, you can go to our website and sign up for our weekly newsletter, which is a great way to follow us on what we're doing. And our website is WCPLTN.org. And until next time, enjoy your world and read.